So we're going to look at shortening the URLs first in this section. And to do that, we're going to create a new class called shortener. And within that class, we're going to need two private variables. First off, we're going to need a DB for the database to be stored in, because we're going to be storing all of our data within a database. And second, we're going to create a variable to contain all of the data that we're going to collect. Which is going to be in the form of an array. So the first thing we're going to do is to create a new function. And this is going to be the construct function. Now this means that whenever we instantiate the shortener, which we've done at the start here, we're going to actually perform this code automatically. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new database instance, and we're going to store this in the DB object. I'm going to actually put the variables in now, but we will actually create the database in the next video. And just because we're using this locally, I'm going to use the root account. So now that we've created this construct function, every time we actually create an instance of the shortener, it's automatically going to connect to the database for us, which is the exact functionality that we're going to want. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a list of all of the functions that we're going to need, and we'll come back and actually populate the functions later on. So the first thing that we're going to need is to create a public function, which is going to generate a unique code for us. And we're not going to use any variables there. The next thing we're going to do is to add links into our database. We'll come back and add all of the detail in later on, as I say. So we're going to create one called resolve URL, which is going to take the short URL and return the long URL to us. We should probably call that resolve short URL. And because we're going to be replicating the functionality of Bitly as closely as possible, we're also going to store some user data. Now this is useful because if we're using this on a live environment, it will allow us to actually see the environment in which the website is operating. If our website's used predominantly by Google Chrome users, for example, we may be able to take advantage of some of the more advanced things within HTML5, which other browsers may not support. So to do this, we're just going to create a store data function. And a get user data function. That should probably be the other way around. So the first thing that we're going to do is actually add a link into our database. So if we're going to use the URL and the short URL from our form, all we really need to do is create a new PDO query, which is going to insert the data into our database for us. And because we're already going to have an instance of the database, we can just reuse that. We're going to obviously use a prepared statement to hopefully limit the damage that can be done to our database. We should probably save the date it was created as well. And when we're obviously using PDO to insert into databases, we just need to bind the values into the query. So to do that, we just need to type query bind value, and then we need to type the actual placeholder that we're using, so in this case URL, and then the value that we want to bind to it, which in this case will be the URL. And we just need to do this for the other two variables that we're passing in as well. So we have the short URL and we have the date that was created. And we'll save that as a timestamp. So to actually execute the query, we just need to type query execute. Now we actually want to check whether the data has been inserted properly into our database rather than just assuming it has been. So we're going to put this inside of an if statement. And then in this case, the query has executed properly. And I'm just going to have an else, which is indicating that it's not executed properly. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to use a session here. And this is going to allow us to pass data back across into our front end so that we can actually display the error message or we can display the valid URL. So in this case, this indicates that there is an error. These are actually incorrect because we've got not here. So if the query is not executed successfully, we have an error. What we're going to do is set a state within our session. We're going to set that to error. We're also going to set another session variable, which will be the response. And we're going to set this to so if we're not able to assign it, we're just going to say could not assign the short URL to the long URL. But we're not going to go into too much detail about why it couldn't be resolved. We will just leave that to the user to identify themselves. So if there isn't an error, we're going to use the session again. And we're going to set the state to error free. And then we're also going to assign a response. And in this case, we're going to pass across the actual link to the short URL, but we're going to give it including the host name. So in our case, it's going to include the workplace. And just to make it actually stable enough that we don't have to worry about moving it into different directories, we're also going to include the path info. Now in our case this isn't actually going to do anything, the path info part, because we're going to be running out of the root directory. But if you wanted to put this within a subdirectory, we wouldn't want to go through and recode everything again. And then after this, we're just going to include the short URL. That's going to take the short URL out of the information that's posted across and add that to the end. Now this will obviously be easy to test when we actually create our database, but for now we're going to have to assume that this is all correct, and then when we do create our database we'll come back and review it all. So the next thing that we need to do is to actually generate our unique codes. Generating codes can be quite tricky because we need to create something which is unique, but not something which is obvious enough that someone can understand the pattern very easily. So to do this, we're going to first create a query using the database object which we've already created for the class. So to do this, we're actually going to find out how many rows we have in the database right now. We're obviously using this links table. And we're going to execute this query. So at this point we should now have the count of how many rows are in the database. So we're going to create a new variable called count. And we're going to just return that value. To actually generate our unique number, we're going to return the base. We're going to actually convert the count of rows into a different format. So we're going to convert it from base 10 into base 36. That's not actually going to give us a very big number, however. And so what we're going to do is actually multiply this by 6,200,000. So 6.2 million. And this will give us a unique identifier, which is going to change depending on how many rows are in the database. And because we're not going to be deleting rows, it's always going to be unique. Finally, we're going to look at resolving the short URL. So what we're going to do here, we're going to take the short URL and we're going to look this up in our database and return the long URL. So to do this, we create a new query. And we obviously need to bind the values. And we're going to bind short URL to the value that we pass across. And when we execute this, we're going to have a result returned to us. And this result is going to be from the query fetch all. And we're going to make sure that we return this data in a numerical array instead of an associative array. Finally, we're going to return the result in the first index. When it comes to getting user data, all we're going to do here is we're going to assign this data. We're going to use the short URL. And most of this we're going to actually get from the user's input or from the environment. So in this case, we're going to use filter import. Now you'll notice I've used get here. We're going to actually use the htaccess file to rewrite our URLs for us so that we actually are able to use them as we intend. And when we're using that, we're going to specify that the unique short URL is going to be passed across as a get value. Everything else that we're using is post, which is why I thought it was important to highlight that unique part of it. So we're also going to store the time. Just going to copy and paste this part. So we're going to store the remote address here, which is actually the user's IP address. We're also going to store the server protocol. Which will be either HTTP 1, HTTP 1.1, or soon HTTP 2. Next we're going to store whether they're using HTTPS. Obviously the user could be using HTTPS or HTTP without the secured layer. We're also going to store the user agent. Now the user agent is actually the browser that the user is using, which can obviously be very, very useful for us, especially when it comes to market research. We're also going to finally store the HTTP referrer. So if our website is being used by other people, we want to be able to monitor that to make sure that it's actually being used correctly and as intended. Finally, when it comes to storing data, we want to just throw all of this information into our database. We obviously have a links table at the moment in our database, which we still haven't created, but we don't want to store all of the user data in that same database. We want to store that in the same separate table. In this case, we're going to call that table track. So what we're going to do when it comes to storing data is create a new variable called attributes. We're going to implode the data array so that we can actually take all of these names out of here rather than typing them all in again. This just adds some resilience so that if we change or add other variables in the future, we don't need to rewrite as much code. We're also going to store the values. And again, this is going to be very similar, except we're also going to separate this by colons. And we're going to append a colon to the start of it. This means that when we create our query, we can just type So if you think about this first line is going to create a list of all of these unique pieces of data. And it's going to be, for example, short URL, comma, space, request time, comma, space, remote address, etc. Because that's what we have here. When it comes to this part, we want to do the exact same thing, but we want to append a colon to the start so that they actually reflect the values that we're going to bind. So this will do, for example, the shortcut URL, comma, space, colon, the time, comma, space, colon, the remote address, which means that we actually need to insert a colon here because we don't have one at the very start. Or we could just do what we've done in this case, which is append the colon to the very start of the values data here. So the next thing that we need to do is create a loop. And all we're going to do here is to query bind value So we're just going to bind every single key to every single value. We're not going to perform any more validation at this point. Finally, we're just going to create an if statement. Where we're going to try to execute the query. And if it doesn't work, we're just going to output a message saying that the URL isn't found. You could, if you wanted, output the error information, but we wouldn't want our end users to actually see that, so we're not going to do that here. But it is something that you could do if you wanted to. I'll just also test out the functionality for the overriding our link. And if we refresh our table now, we can see both of these have worked correctly.